Welcome to Adult Storytime at the Bedford Public Library. I'm so glad you got to join us this evening. It's so dark and dreary, and I was not sure how many people would venture out. So thank you very much for doing that. I appreciate it. We're going to read a story this evening called Mrs. November's Dinner Party. Now, this is a fun one. So go back to my notes so I don't screw this up. Classic American folktale. So 1880, I think you're going to love it. It was published in Harper's Young People magazine, and I don't know if that rings any bells. If any of you read Laura Ingalls Wilder series, this is one of the magazines that they would send out west to the kids there to read. So probably she got the first edition of this and read it, and we're going to read it this evening as well. It was first published in 1879 as a weekly illustrated 16-page magazine. It contained both fiction and nonfiction. Again, it was called the Harper's Young People. Just thought that was fascinating, just to know who was reading it when it first came out. That was kind of cool. This is by Agnes Carr, 2 R's, C-A-R-R. Again, it was published in 1880. Mrs. November's Dinner Party by Agnes Carr. The widow November was very busy indeed this year. What with elections and harvest homes, her hands were full to overflowing. For she takes great interest in politics, besides being a social body without whom no apple bee or corn husking is complete. Still, worn out as she was, when her 30 sons and daughters clustered round and begged that they might have their usual family dinner on Thanksgiving Day, she could not find it in her hospitable heart to refuse, and immediately invitations were sent to her 11 brothers and sisters, Old Father Time and Mother Year, to come with all their families and celebrate the great American holiday. Then what a busy time ensued. What a slaughter of unhappy barnyard families, turkeys and ducks and chickens. What a chopping of apples and boiling of donuts. What a picking of raisins and rolling of pie crusts, until every nook and corner of the immense storeroom was stocked with savory mince and toothsome pumpkin pies. While so great was the confusion that even the stolid red servant, Indian Summer, lost his head and smoked so continually he always appeared surrounded by a blue mist as he piled logs upon the great bonfires in the yard until they lighted up the whole country for miles around. But at length all was ready. The happy days had come, and the little Novembers and their best bib and tucker were seated in a row awaiting the arrival of their uncles, aunts, and cousins, while their mother, in russet brown silk trimmed with misty lace, looked them over, straightening Guy Fawkes's collar, tying Thanksgiving's neck ribbon, and setting a dispute between 2 little presidential candidates as to which should sit at the head of the table. Soon, a merry clashing of bells and blowing of horns and mingling of voices were heard outside, and sleighs and carriages dashed up to the door, and in came, just in season, Grandpa Time with Grandma Year leaning on his arm, followed by all their children and grandchildren, and were warmly welcomed by the hostess and her family. "Oh, how glad I am we could all come today," said Mr. January in his crisp, clear tones, throwing off his great fur coat and rushing to the blazing fire. "There is nothing like the happy returns of these days." "Oh, nothing indeed," simpered Mrs. February, the poetess. "If I had had time, I should have composed some verses for the occasion, but my son Valentine has brought a sugar heart with a sweet sentiment on it to his cousin Thanksgiving. I, too, have taken the liberty of bringing a sort of adopted child of mine, young Leap Year, who makes us a visit every 4 years." "He is very welcome, I am sure," said Mrs. November, patting Leap Year kindly on the head. "And Sister March, how have you been since we last met?" "Oh, we have had the north, south, east, and west winds all at our house, and they have kept things breezy, I assure you. But I really feared we should not get here today, for when we came to dress, I found nearly everything we had was lent." So that must account for our shabby appearance. Hee hee hee, tittered little April Fool, what a sell! And he shook until the bells on his cap rang, at which his father ceased for a moment showering kisses on his nieces and nephews and boxed his ears for his rudeness. "Oh, Aunt May, do tell us a story," clamored the younger children, and dragging her into a corner, she was soon deep in such a moving tale that they were all melted to tears, especially the little Aprils, who cry very easily. Meanwhile, Mrs. June, assisted by her youngest daughter, a sweet girl graduate, just from school, was engaged in decking the apartment with roses and lilies and other fragrant flowers that she had brought from her extensive gardens and conservatories, until the room was a perfect bower of sweetness and beauty, while Mr. July draped the walls with flags and banners, lighted the candles, and showed off the tricks of his pet eagle, Yankee Doodle, to the great delight of the little ones. Madam August, who suffers a great deal with the heat, found a seat on a comfortable sofa as far from the fire as possible, and waved a huge feather fan back and forth, while her 31 boys and girls led the 2 oldest, Holiday and Vacation, ran riot through the long rooms, picking at their Aunt June's flowers and playing all sorts of pranks regardless of the tumbled hair and torn clothes, while they shouted, "Hurrah for fun!" and behaved like a pack of wild colts let loose in a green pasture, until their Uncle September called them, together with his own children, into the library and persuaded them to read some of the books with which the shelves were filled, or play quietly with the game of authors and the dissected maps. "For," said Mr. September to Mrs. October, "I think Sister August lets her children romp too much. I always like improving games for mine, although I have great trouble in making Equinox toe the line as he should." "That is because you are a schoolmaster," laughed Mrs. October, shaking her head, adorned with a wreath of gaily tinted leaves. "But where is my baby?" And at that moment a cry was heard without, and Indian Summer came running in to say that little All Hallows had fallen into a tub of water while trying to catch an apple that was floating on top. And Mrs. October, rushing off to the kitchen, returned with her youngest in a very wet and dripping condition, and screaming at the top of his lusty little lungs. He could only be consoled by a handful of chestnuts, which his nurse, Miss Frost, cracked open for him. The little Novembers, meanwhile, were having a charming time with their favorite cousins, the Decembers, who were always so gay and jolly and had such a delightful papa. He came with his pockets stuffed full of toys and sugar plums, which he drew out from time to time, and gave to his best-loved child, Merry Christmas, to distribute amongst the children, who gathered eagerly around their little cousin, saying, "Christmas comes but once a year, but when she comes, she brings good cheer." At which Mary laughed gaily and tossed her golden curls, in which were twined sprays of holly and clusters of brilliant scarlet berries. At last, the great folding doors were thrown open, and Indian Summer announced that dinner was served, and a long procession of old and young was quickly formed and led by Mrs. November, her daughter Thanksgiving, whose birthday it was. They filed into the spacious dining room where stood the long table, groaning beneath the weight of good things, while 4 servants ran continually in and out, bringing more substantials and delicates to grace the board and please the appetite. Winter staggered beneath great trenchers of meat and poultry, pies and puddings, and spring brought the earliest and freshest vegetables, summer the richest creams and ices, while autumn served the guests with fruit and poured the sparkling wine. All were gay and jolly, and many a joke was cracked as the contents of each plate and dish melted away like snow before the sun, and the great fires roared in the wide chimneys as though singing a glad Thanksgiving song. New Year drank everybody's health and wished them many returns of the day, while Twelfth Night ate so much cake he made himself quite ill and had to be put to bed. Valentine sent mottos to all the little girls and praised their bright eyes and glossy curls. For, said his mother, he is a sad flatterer, and not nearly so truthful, I am sorry to say, as his brother George Washington, who never told a lie. At which Grandfather Time gave George a quarter and said he should always remember what a good boy he was. After dinner the fun increased. All trying to do something for the general amusement, Mrs. March persuaded her son St. Patrick to dance the Irish jig, which he did to the tune of the Wearing of the Green, which his brothers Windy and Gusty blew and whistled on their fingers. Easter sang a beautiful song, and the little Mays tripped the light, fantastic toe in a pretty fancy dance, while the Junes sat by so smiling and sweet it was a pleasure to look at them. Independence, the fourth child of Mr. July, who is a bold little fellow and a fine speaker, gave them an oration he had learned at school. And the August suggested games of tag and blind man's bluff, which they all enjoyed heartily. Mr. September tried to read an instructive story aloud, but was interrupted by Equinox, April Fool, and All Little Hallows, who pinned streamers to his coat-tails, covered him with flour, and would not let him get through a line, at which Mrs. October hugged her tricksy baby and laughed until she cried, and Mr. September retired in disgust. "That is almost too bad," said Mrs. November as she shook the popper vigorously, in which the corn was popping and snapping merrily. "But Thanksgiving, you must not forget to thank your cousins for all they have done to honor your birthday." At which the demure little maiden went round to each one and returned her thanks in such a charming way it was quite captivating. And Grandmother Year said at last began to nod over her teacup in the chimney corner. "It is growing late," said Grandpa Time. "But we must have a Virginia reel before we go," said Mr. December. "Oh, yes, yes," cried all the children. Merry Christmas played a lively air on the piano, and old and young took their positions on the polished floor with Grandpa and Grandma at the head. Midsummer danced with Happy New Year. June's commencement with August's holiday, leap year with May Day, and all went merry as a marriage bell. The fun was at its heights when suddenly the clock in the corner struck 12, and Grandma Year motioned all to stop, and Grandfather Time, bowing his head, said softly, "Hark, my children, Thanksgiving Day is ended."